Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it feels like, though, we should be talking a lot more in terms of confidence intervals as a pet peeve, because then you start to get bounds for things. I think we'd all agree that the fatality rate on average for this virus is between, I don't know, 0.1% and 10%. It's somewhere in there, right? So, and I mean, how do you make a good guess within that? There's things that mathematics can tell you. If you're guessing on things of that range, maybe you should be taking geometric means, which means you end up around 1%. There are dangers with taking arithmetic means, because then you end up at 5%.
Yeah, but look, the point estimates I think got us in a lot of trouble, because the Imperial College model and the scary scenarios that were a lot about point estimates. Saying, okay, 80% of the population is going to get infected. The death rate is 3%, or fatality rate is 3%. And then we get these enormous numbers, which never came anywhere near to be true. Even Neil Ferguson backing off the numbers. The competing Oxford model, which said it was ridiculous. But if we looked at various scenarios, like you're saying, with various ranges of case fatality rates, and we could probably make a better judgment. But I don't think that was done.
No,
we don't know fully. A lot of it's secret, and we don't know how governments were making decisions. But I'd be surprised if they looked at the range of possibilities rather than just scary point estimates and body bags and politicians over-insuring and saying, okay, let's shut down the economy.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's maybe use that as a launching point. I know Bruce wanted to talk about some of the labor issues, and I'm curious, though, in the interest of practicing good science. I mean, what do you say is the range for the economic impact? I mean, are we talking about as a layperson, again, maybe I would say it's between, I'll go out there and I'll say my guess is somewhere between, I'm going to be cautious here, between 100 billion and 100 trillion, right? Somewhere in there.
Yeah, look, what comes to mind is I'm thinking of the discussion in Israel in particular before lockdown. The central bank came up with an estimate of how much lockdown would cost. They didn't come up with the confidence intervals, but they came up with a point estimate of it would cost 1% in GDP growth. Okay. So the Israeli economy was growing, I think, at 3%. They said, okay, it'll drop to 2%. It's a 33% drop. It's huge, but still 2% growth. And look at all the benefits we would get from saved lives from locking down. It turns out that it was a contraction of 5%. Rather than a decrease in growth of 1%. So this was just so far off. I like to say the macroeconomic models are probably just as bad as the epidemiological model. Yes, the epidemiological models out there. So yeah, that's a pretty big range there. 1% from 2% growth to 5% contraction, and I think my guess is that a lot of the macroeconomists, central banks, were saying this to governments all over in the U.S. and in the U.K. So I don't want to venture a forecast or give you some confidence.
Could I push you for a range?
I just try to rely on a bit of logic together with some empirical evidence that we can gather and we can rely on together to make a cost-benefit analysis. And that's what we did back in March when we published this piece in the Jerusalem Post, and we said lockdown is a losing proposition. But, to put particular numbers on it, that's a difficult thing to do. We don't know how many heart attacks will happen because hospital units were closed down and focused on COVID. How do you put numbers on this? It would be scientism to actually put numbers on that, I think. I don't think we can.
Interesting.
It's too scientific, I think. But we can use logic, and we can think, okay, we have testimonies from physicians who said, or we look at the percentage drop in cases that were analyzed for a possible heart attack, stroke, and so on. And we can make some calculations, rough calculations based on that together with logic and say, look, it doesn't seem like the benefits of lockdown outweigh the costs. So I'm not willing to commit on certain numbers. Just a bit of logic, a bit of tracing out the unintended consequences, a little bit of, are those unintended consequences, do they have any empirical basis? And then we do a rough calculation in our minds.
Yeah, certainly.
And we could all weigh things differently. We could have different weights, and that's legitimate.
So would it be fair then to say that it's somewhere between, what's the current growth? I'm just curious, just to try and work this out for myself.
I mean, contraction. I mean, we're in recession everywhere.
No. I mean, so if you take it as the delta between what's happened and what was previously happening, so are we saying it's between 5%?
Okay, so I would go back again to Sweden, comparing the best counterfactuals we have: South Korea, Sweden, versus where lockdown light versus lockdown heavy.
Yeah.
And the truth is, it's too early to tell. I mean, we're seeing huge unemployment numbers, and also we're seeing bad numbers in South Korea and Sweden as well. Bad economic numbers. It's going to take a while for those numbers to prove themselves in terms of, will Sweden and South Korea take less of an economic hit? Will they recover faster? That remains to be seen.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty confident they will.
Yeah.
It just seems logical, given that they didn't shut everything down. Of course, there's going to be contraction there now because there's no travel, there's no tourism, there's supply lines have been hammered and so on. So the whole global economy is going to suffer. But when it comes to recovery now, will we see differential recovery? Will Sweden and South Korea recover first and quicker? My guess is yes. That's as far as I'm pretty confident.
Be very curious to see it happen. I mean, certainly, that'd be good. I'm very curious to hear about your speed limit analogy as a wannabe.
Right. So we got attacked. We got a lot of pushback. We got a lot of attack. We got a lot of insults from people in reaction to what we wrote against lockdown, saying that we don't care about human life and that we only care about money. And it's a very hurtful thing to say, but look, it's a fact of life that we do trade off lives and money. We do it with speed limits. So if we lowered the speed limit to 30 miles an hour, there are estimates out there how many lives we would save in the country. But we don't want to do that. I don't think as a society we want to have 30 mile an hour speed limits, knowing that it will save many lives. So we're implicitly making these kinds of lives, money, time trade-offs all the time. Interestingly, they say that in France, the Gilets jaunes protests were a lot about the reduction in the speed limit from 90 kilometers an hour to 80 on some of the non-highway roads. So that it was costing people more money and time to get into Paris for work and so on. And even though it might have saved lives, it was an economic burden, and it led to protests in the street.
Yeah, so I think, I like that analogy a lot.
So people care about money and time, don't they?
So, let's talk about speed limits, because I think that's a great analogy, and it's a great analogy because it also seems to speak to something we've been talking about earlier, in the sense that speed limits are not constant everywhere, and that it's probably very justified to have, and I don't know, I'm not a transportation expert, but it seems justified to have a 25 mile an hour speed limit in a school zone, where kids might be erratic and running out on the street. And so that feels justified. On the other hand, why would you justify a 75 mile an hour speed limit in the middle of Arizona? Why not an Autobahn? So I'm curious if
it's a bit arbitrary.
It is very arbitrary, right? So, and you made this point that to me is very curious about how we come up with, you said as a society, we don't decide that we want a 30 mile an hour speed limit. I think that's certainly true. I don't know many people who would want a 30 mile an hour speed limit, especially now as we're faced with the prospect of having to drive everywhere. And And but it feels like how do you come to that decision economically? I mean, I know there's history, there's lots of issues around efficiency, economy, things like that. But just from a public safety perspective versus an economic trade-off perspective, I mean, why 65? Why 70?
Yeah, it's far too slow.
Yeah, certainly.
But yeah, no, I think it's a good question. I suppose it would be tinkering. You know, if some politician came up, local politician, national, and said, okay, we're raising it to 90, 95, and then we did see lots of deaths on the road, and there was an uproar about that. Perhaps we know where we reached the limit. I think there has to, you know, in a way, we need to discover that incrementally. Mm-hmm. Perhaps somehow it emerged. It was emergent, 65, 70 in the U.S., given the risk profile and the implicit trade-offs between money and life that Americans are willing to make versus the Germans. So yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to know exactly how we came up with these, but in some way they must have been emergent. And if you try to tinker with them too much, I think we'll hear protests in the street, like in France, and the Gilets jaunes, one way or the other.
So that's
yeah, and I'd like to mention also about pollution too, because that's also another area where we trade off lives and money. So if we want to reduce pollution and save many lives, in fact, there was some estimate that in China with the lockdown, there was a huge drop in pollution levels, and you feed those into some models about how many lives are to be saved, and it's an enormous amount of lives to be saved from the lockdown, on the other side of the ledger, actually, due to decreased pollution. But as a society, we don't want zero pollution, do we? Because that means zero production. Yeah. So we're willing to have people die in our society from pollution to a certain extent so that we can produce things, we can consume, and we can live our normal lives. Now, where is that optimality? Where's the optimal amount of pollution? Again, it's the same as the speed limit. How did we get to, I think it's changing all the time. I think it's a process. It's a dialogue. It's an emergent system. And we're converging all the time on where it's acceptable to make that trade-off between money and lives, so to speak. But I think it's illegitimate to say it's not legitimate to make a trade-off. We do make trade-offs.
We do make trade-offs.
Yeah.
Certainly. I think we do make trade-offs, and that's something we've come back to. I don't know, Bruce, we haven't done a full episode on trade-offs, have we? We probably should.
No, we keep mentioning it over and over and over again whenever we talk about risk, so we should probably focus on that. I mean, I think, Rob, your analogy to the Gilets jaunes and also speed limits, so in general, that we could tinker with them and then we know when we've gone too far when there's a public outcry, right? Right. So the analogy I thought of that where we've seen this happen is in airline security, where the initial response to 9/11 was hand search all checked baggage, hand search all passengers at one point, confiscate all their liquids. I mean, it's just incredibly intrusive and it becomes very expensive. And yeah, the government can absorb some of that expense and the airlines absorb some of it, but in the end, it all comes back to the consumer or the taxpayer. So it's incredibly expensive. And then the limit was reached when passengers were being asked to go in backscatter scanners, which have lots of controversies about health risks, and the alternative to that is a pat down, and the pat downs were very intrusive, and there's privacy concerns with the images that can be produced by backscatter. And then there was a revolt. So then politicians and the public were organizing a no-fly day as a protest against what they saw as excessive security. And then the government doesn't say, oh, we hear you, we've gone too far, we're just going to dial it back a bit. They don't admit that. They say, oh, well, the security levels have been lowered. We can lower our security measures. But for me, from my observation and my conversations with officials, it was very clear. Officials realized we've reached the limit of how much security we can we can trade off against the economic costs and the public reaction. So that's a really...
I think that's a great analogy to what's happening now, where lockdown may never happen again. I think the politicians have seen, they've pushed it too far. They're seeing the unemployment numbers, they're seeing the economic numbers, and they're hearing now about the unintended consequences in terms of public health, other areas of public health, and they know they've pushed it too far. And so any new wave easing and new waves or second wave next winter and so on, my bet is we won't see a lockdown for exactly that reason that you mentioned.
Yeah. So how do you come up on the happy middle ground or the unhappy middle ground? Because everybody's going to be unhappy, but that feels like an extremely important part of both science, in the sense of anybody who's trying to optimize anything is at some level trying to find a compromise between usually multiple factors. Otherwise, why are you trying to optimize to begin with? It feels like there's got to be something that science can say. Coming from a data perspective, it seems a little bit alarming to say that we're just going to wait till the protests happen. And certainly, I'm admitting now that there's facts and then there's values, and both of those things are at play here. So it's not just like we discussed, if you didn't care about anything ethical or values, you put everybody in a negative pressure room with 50 Cliff Bars and wait it out 2 months. And probably at that point, you'll be coronavirus free. New Zealand has done, I think, if you believe their testing numbers, a fabulous job with that. They have a smaller population, they're an island. Lots of things in their favor, but it seems like it can be done. How do we find that trade-off? From both an economic perspective, at what point, if you look at the legal system, a life has all the values.
I think we have the models. I think that the South Korean and the Swedish experience is the future. We need to test, trace, isolate particular segments, at-risk segments of the population, and work off of that. That's the way to go, rather than the draconian responses that we've seen. That's the way I see it, and I'm shocked. I'm astonished that it's taking this long to get there. I think that Sweden the Swedish model is being attacked, but I think for political reasons. Somehow it's become a political issue that the Norwegian or the Scandinavian model used to be admired by the left, and now it's become the enemy of the left. Maybe I'm generalizing far too much, but exaggerating. But it seems that way, that the anti-lockdown and pro-lockdown has become a political issue, and it's well split between different along the spectrum, political spectrum.
It's interesting. We're talking about Sweden. I'm reminded of this book by Hans Rosling. You might have heard of it. Swedish public health expert who wrote this book called Factfulness. And we're reading this when we were trying to build the new data science course. And I think the thing I really appreciate about the book is that there are very clear signs, according to Hans, and things that you look for. So, why are we so worried about Ebola as opposed to being as worried about colds or the flu? There's been a lot of discussion about COVID versus flu. I'm not even going to get into that. I think it's a little bit... but Ebola, I think most people...
let me just push back on that a bit. If you look at confidence intervals, there's a bit of an overlap between if 2017, 18 seasonal flu. I think that if I remember correctly, the confidence intervals were between 45,000 and 116,000. Yeah. With a point estimate of 61,000, if I remember. So once we see the confidence intervals at the end of the day, there may be some overlap between the 17, 18 seasonal flu. Forget about 68 and 57. 1957 was point estimate was 116,000. But I agree with you, this is worse than the seasonal flu, there's no doubt. We don't see this every year. But how much worse? When you look at, and is the extent that it's worse justify the measures, some measures that we take?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point. And I mean, it's interesting because you say, well, what are the signs you look for to say that it's worse? And I mean, Hans always talks about this idea of exponential growth. And we've talked about this in the past. But coming back to, I mean, so we know it's worse, whether it's probably on the higher end, it's probably less than, let's say, 100 times worse. It is worse, I think. So it's between factor 1 in 100 in terms of how severe it is, let's just say, for notion. So, I mean, how would we address that economically? So if we say that something is between 1 and 100 times worse, that doesn't mean you want to make the economy between 1 and 100 times. So it's not a multiplying factor of 1. Because if we...
It's a good question. How bad does it have to be before we say it justifies?
Yeah.
Putting us all in solitary confinement.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean...
it's an open question. But it just seems that for this particular virus, given the geographical concentration, given the age concentration, if you like, those at risk, that there are other ways to do it besides lockdown.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a huge fan of what you said earlier, which is test, trace, and isolate, because it feels, mathematically speaking, as well.
And if there's going to be any kind of lockdown, if it's going to happen, it should be geographically concentrated. So
and it should be
lockdown, a geographical area where there's 0 deaths in 5 cases, the same way you lock down New York.
Yeah,
to me, it's completely absurd and damaging.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I should add from a political scientific perspective, it's just fairer to do it that way. It's politically and socially fairer to test and track the hotspots and quarantine the hotspots, which may be as small as a family household. That is fairer than locking down a whole nation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's an issue that is not being discussed, because particularly, like, you take the case of Britain, there is such a default position of we're all in this together, and let's protect the NHS and let's protect the nation as a whole. People are unwilling to, at the beginning of the crisis, they're unwilling to express their concerns about the fairness of a lockdown and the trade-offs against liberties. But then there's going to be a backlash, right? So they're storing up their resentment, and there's going to be a really bad backlash. And as I said, Britain, it's clearest in the British case that there's going to be hell to pay. There is going to be an inquiry, and the government's going to look really exposed on at least its initial policy. I mean, the contradictions and the U-turns and ridiculous contradictions like social distancing but no face masks and things like that. I mean, it just wasn't making sense. So we can repress some of these. We can repress admission of some of these trade-offs like liberties at the beginning, but we're just storing up trouble later.
No, I agree, and I would encourage lawsuits. I think that businesses and individuals should be suing the government. I think in the UK there's an interesting case by Simon Dole against the government, claiming that lockdown was illegal. It was against some human rights charters, and the right to property, the right to run your own business, and basically it's one could think of this on the level of theft. This is government theft of private property. Ostensibly for the public good, but nonetheless theft. Is it justified theft? That I believe the courts should determine.
So let me. So I mean, I think we're in agreement that there are certainly many unintended consequences. And in terms of trade-offs, I mean, it feels like what we want to do is we want to find elements that are good that can also be incentivized. So we were talking about test, isolate, trace. And there's other things along those lines. I mean, but I see in the United States, we've been struggling even with being able to scale up contact tracing. We've been struggling with being able to scale up testing. Are there, I mean, I'm just curious because I want to see this work. Are there economic incentives? I mean, how do you incentivize an investment in the sorts of things like more testing, maybe at-home testing, check-ins, telehealth check-ins, or isolation? I mean, how do you incentivize somebody to stay home when they are actually posing a risk?
Yeah, I think that we're never going to get 100% compliance when we rely on voluntary behavior, that's for sure.
Of course.
But I think nonetheless it's the best alternative to, to allow people, maybe there could be fines, other ways to incentivize people not to violate quarantine. For example, I'm in quarantine right now. I landed in Israel on Tuesday in Tel Aviv, and 14 days quarantine. And I was told at the airport that if I leave, if anybody comes in to visit me, or if I step outside this apartment, I will be hit with a 5,000 shekel fine, which is about $1,500 or so, roughly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to pay $1,500 stuff. So that incentive. So there you go. There's voluntary. They wouldn't whisk me off to jail.
Yeah.
But those kind of monetary penalties incentivize you to behave properly, so to speak, and to internalize the externality of risking the public, because I'm assumed to have it because I was traveling. So I need to do this 14-day quarantine. As far as testing is concerned, I think the private sector should have been involved much earlier, and there were turf wars by the NHS, by the CDC. They caused bottlenecks, and I think testing was a huge mess because of that. Getting private companies involved. It reminds me of when Richard Branson said he would supply California with 500 ventilators or something like that early on in March. There you go. There's a private sector response, which I think it needs to be encouraged. Governments can offer lotteries, huge lotteries, to pharmaceutical companies to come up with vaccines. That solves some of the incentive problems there. So there's lots that can be done to incentivize actors and all the agents in this story, which doesn't involve top-down violations of civil liberties and theft of property, private property, and so on.
So there is a lot that, and then it seems like there's also things you can do. There's corporations that I will not name that I've heard of trying to, it feels like incentivizing corporations themselves to offer testing to employees as a way of kind of encouraging recovery in a manner that is safe. Seems, from what I've heard, I don't think we have a lot of evidence for people trying it yet, but from what I can see has been, sounds like a reasonable idea, at least.
I think in South Korea it was quite successful, and they publicized the paths of people that have someone who was infected was in a local restaurant, and they just publicized that, and then people stayed away voluntarily from that restaurant and other areas which were potential hotspots. So I think that could work. I think tracing is. Contact tracing raises a lot of problematic issues.
Yeah, certainly.
Privacy, for civil liberties. Yeah. And there it's going to be challenging to find, I believe, but maybe incentivizing people to report. Because right now I'm being cell phone tracked by the Israeli government. As soon as I came in, I gave my cell number, and So they know if anybody comes near me, unless they leave their cell phone outside, and or if I leave, or if I shut it off, it could be a problem. So that this was a temporary allowance. The courts here, the Supreme Court, allowed this to happen just during this crisis, but then they'll have to stop once the crisis is over, no longer be allowed. But this is troubling because there's usually this kind of it's not so easy to get rid of these laws once they're implemented. They tend to stick around. They're far too persistent. And in China, from what I understand, it was much worse with bracelets. There were, I don't know if this is true, but I heard that there were bracelets put on people that were connected by Bluetooth to their phone, and so you couldn't. So if you left your apartment under quarantine, the bracelet would be too far from the phone. They would know that, and then they made you take selfies apparently, because you could pass the bracelet to somebody else sitting in your apartment next to your phone, and you can go out for a walk. But if you have to take a selfie every hour on the hour, showing you in the bracelet and the phone, I don't know. I've heard this discussed. I don't know if it's true, but this raises many issues of if this is where we're going in the future. I find this very problematic, very worrisome. I prefer to rely on incentives and voluntary behavior of compliance, and even if we don't get 100% compliance. But this kind of state top-down intervention in our lives is, to me, a huge violation of civil liberties. It's unacceptable.
Yeah, well, on that note, thank you, Rob. I think that that illustrates what I appreciate about talking with you is the specificity of your position and the breadth of application that you have in your willingness to apply your economic expertise broadly in all sorts of areas in erudite and logical ways is really, really refreshing, because I come from political science where there is too much fence sitting and hedging one's bets. I've said this before, so I'm not betraying anything new here. So I really, really enjoyed talking with you, Rob. This has been fascinating. I hope we get another chance.
Yeah, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. And it was very stimulating to speak with both of you as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob. Likewise, it's been a pleasure, and it's really interesting to hear how we think about. I mean, I'm inspired now to say that we've got to have. Our last episode we talked about the importance of having conversations, and sometimes difficult ones, uncomfortable ones, because we're wrestling with really important issues. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, and I'll characterize this as interdisciplinary cross-fertilization in action.
Great. I find it too, when I try not to introduce myself as an economist, because I find it's far too narrow, and I don't want to be thought. I've trained as an economist, but I don't want to be thought of as an economist. I find that almost as an insult.
Yeah. It's like introducing yourself as a political scientist. It's so loaded, where you're not really a scientist, et cetera, right? Yeah.
Well, we should say seekers of truth.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the discussion.
Thanks.
We are the risky scientists. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.